Well, there wasn't an exorcism offering in seminary. The instructional books on the subject aren't exactly recommended reading, and I haven't had any mentors who list this as one of their ministry strengths. But performing exorcisms for Jesus is important work, and all throughout the Gospels, Jesus is confronting unclean spirits and demons, commanding them to depart. And before all is said and done, he gives his disciples the same power of exorcism, which leaves me feeling ill-equipped. I know I'm not as proficient as I should be. This is not an area where I have a lot of expertise. So it's heartening to see that Jesus doesn't really do anything that seems particularly unusual as part of this first exorcism. There are no chants. He doesn't carry a special dagger or any sacred relics. And as far as I can tell, there's no bloodletting involved. Nobody's head spins around. Clearly, Jesus didn't see that movie. There is not much in the way of weird supernatural stuff at all in this story. The guy with the unclean spirit doesn't seem to look, act, or do anything different than anybody else in the synagogue until the spirit confronts Jesus. Watching Jesus, I get the idea that enacting an exorcism is not as weird as we might think that it is. All he does is confront the spirit, tell it to be silent, and come out. Jesus names the unclean spirit and tells it to get out of town. Now, after seeing demons and spirits depicted in Hollywood, it's kind of a letdown, honestly. I mean, just speak up and tell those forces to be quiet. Tell them to hush their ideology, hush their propaganda, hush their tempting voices dressed in familiar clothes of realism and resignation. That is it. Tell them to leave this community and go somewhere else. It's that simple. Confront the demons at work in the world, which has a lot less to do with the supernatural, imaginary stuff of the movies, but evil that takes aim in very intentional ways. Evil, a much abused term that simply means that which is opposed to God's dream for the way the world must be. Those forces that leave the most vulnerable people around us holding the bag for sins they did not commit, actions they did not take, decisions they were never given the power to make. Confront those demons so that people who are tormented by them can be whole again. The trouble is that unclean spirits like this one are legion. They are everywhere. Consider the housing development of the communities in between Richmond and Oakland, California during and after World War II. A number of us read all about it in Richard Rothstein's The Color of Law. In 1943, the largest wartime government-insured housing project intended for war workers at naval shipyards and factories was built then for 17,000 residents. It was financed by a $7 million FHA authorized loan from Bank of America and the American Trust Company. Houses were sold at low prices to be within reach of war workers. And like most of the housing of the time, it was restricted for whites only and included restrictive covenants to prevent future resales to African Americans. Those racial restrictions were advertised to whites after the war ended as one of the central amenities for workers wishing to relocate to a newly constructed Ford factory in the area. And those racial restrictions were required under the terms of the $7 million FHA-backed loan that financed the project. Black workers, meanwhile, had long commutes to get to the plant. Now, the Quakers were the first ones who attempted to cast out those unclean spirits with a plan to build a racially integrated neighborhood. And the Ford Union supported the idea. They first tried to carve out some unsold units in existing all-white developments, but no developer would sell to African Americans. Undaunted, the Quakers recruited a builder, yet no financial institution in the region would provide funds for a housing development allowing sales to African Americans. Undaunted, those exorcists flew across the country to New York, recruited a banker who agreed to issue the loan. But when the Santa Clara Board of Supervisors found out about the deal, they rezoned the site from residential to industrial use. Undaunted, the builder found a second plot, but Mountain View officials told him they'd never grant the necessary approvals. So the builder found a third plot near the Ford plant. But when that town found out, they adopted a new zoning law, increasing the minimum lot size from 6,000 to 8,000 square feet, making the project unfeasible for working class buyers. Those old demons, I tell you, are persistent. This just developer found a fourth plot, but the seller canceled the option when he learned it would be integrated. So the builder, after 4 tries to do the right thing, he gave up. The Ford Union, determined to build integrated housing to support all of its workers, recruited a second builder. He suggested that why don't we try to build 2 projects, one integrated and the other all white? But as they worked through the details, it became obvious that this would result in an all-white and all-black subdivision, with the white one built in the suburbs and the black one built in a less desirable area. These demons are fierce, but so are those who are committed to exercising them. So the union was offered a chance to vote on the idea, and the overwhelmingly white union voted to support only developers who would commit to integrated housing. I guess we all have to be careful these days with those assumptions that I sometimes hear that white working class people are somehow more racist than those behind desks with college degrees. Unclean spirits do not discriminate. The union found another developer. For 6 months, he tried to secure financing, but was turned down by every single bank because they knew that the project would not be able to secure FHA government backing, since the policy of our government was only to fund racially segregated developments. Racial integration carried an interest rate of 5.5 to 9 added percentage points above the rate he would pay if he agreed for it to be segregated. So the dejected developer told the union he couldn't make it work. But they told him, hey, stick with it and we'll find the financing. So they flew back to New York, where MetLife once again said, yes, we will back the project. But then the city council of Milpitas, where the development was planned, got wind of the project, and its sanitary board held an emergency meeting where they adopted an ordinance increasing the sewer connection fee by more than 10 times the original figure. The developer had to suspend work. And the mayor of Milpitas, for his part, denied that race had anything to do with it. Black people had told him, he said, that they didn't want to live someplace where they weren't wanted. Ooh, those unclean spirits can be so sneaky with their talk. The union launched a public campaign, and the Attorney General promised to investigate racial discrimination, and you could say that it worked. The integrated project was finally built, but the FHA still wouldn't issue mortgages to anyone living in integrated housing. And more than a year after the Ford plant opened, the first 500 units were sold to African American families, but the costs incurred made it unaffordable to all but the highest skilled, highest paid laborers. Later, the Ford plant changed its own policies. They would only hire workers living close to the plant. And those workers, of course, were mostly white. The Bible speaks of unseen forces such as unclean spirits, not simply because pre-scientific people were somehow dumber than we all are, but because they recognize that there are forces at work so pervasive and strong that they seem to require holy power to name and root out. Spiritual forces that wear people out in their well-doing, which isn't a problem restricted to mid-century citizens living in de jure segregated America. It is the same illness that affects us today, where unclean spirits seem so pervasive that most people, like the disciples or the religious leaders or your average resident in Capernaum, just ignores them, puts up with them, builds up resistance to them, goes about their day-to-day business alongside them. Notice that Jesus does the opposite. He names the unclean spirit, confronts it, because he knows that a man who is tormented by that spirit is capable of being healed. He knows the community is capable of being healed, which might be one of the hardest challenges of our time, as hard as it was for the disciples who were used to saying to themselves, yes, there are demons in the world, but there's nothing I can do to change them. Hard for religious leaders who are used to focusing on institutional questions that are somehow easier to solve. Meanwhile, Jesus focuses on the healing. Notice that Jesus doesn't shame or blame the man with the unclean spirit. For all we know, the man is doing the best he can with what he's got. We don't know how or when this demon entered his world. We don't know if it was him or his parents who sinned. We just know that he's suffering. And so are the people around him. And notice, too, that Jesus doesn't start with big questions like, if God exists, why are there unclean spirits in the first place? If God is real, why do people like this suffer? Not only are those questions extremely difficult to answer in any satisfactory way, but they sometimes keep us from focusing on the assignment at hand, which is to bring healing where we can. And notice finally that Jesus isn't bothered by the fact that there will be plenty of other unclean spirits infecting the world all around him. He doesn't seem worried or bothered by questions like, will healing this one person make any difference in the grand scheme of things? He knows that healing one person always makes a difference for someone. In fact, reading this story again and again, I realize that the unclean spirit that seems to be infecting the whole Capernaum cast of characters is the one that whispers hopelessness in the ears of an occupied people who seem to have given up hope for any change. No, Jesus' actions say, do not let that demon seize your minds. But also, sometimes we are the ones who bring the healing. Other times, we are the ones who need to be healed. Ray Ellis needed to be healed, a British soldier in World War II captured by the Axis powers. He had been marched across North Africa along with other prisoners of war. They had been starved, broken down, with many of them dying as they made the forced trek. Marched now into the jeering crowds of Mussolini's Italy, people spat on them, hit them with fists and clubs. And then Ray said, suddenly from out of the crowds, a young girl came and placed a big peach in Ray's hand. She ran back and hid herself in the crowd. I can remember it, Ray said. I don't think I've ever tasted anything better than that peach. He burst into tears. Reflecting later as an old man, Ray said, "It made me realize that when you think the whole world is against you and things are going wrong, I always think there's a girl with a peach somewhere." The world is full of unclean spirits. They are persistent and pervasive. But like Jesus in Capernaum, there's always a girl with a peach somewhere. Maybe today you're the one who needs to receive it. Maybe tomorrow you're the one who can give it to someone who needs it. Healing for one person, maybe? Hope for the world.